We're going to talk now about women and politics. And this is a rather large topic, but we'll only be able to touch on some really basic kind of ideas. But let's go. First of all, just to give you an idea of what we're going to be focusing on here, our objectives are to understand how the exclusion and subordination of women in other realms, society at large, carries over into politics and governmental leadership. Also to understand about political participation through suffrage or voting and leadership. And then finally, we're going to do a little bit to put the United States situation of women's political participation into a larger context. So there's been a long struggle for inclusion. Just to state the obvious, women's rights as human rights includes civil and political rights. And they have been included in the international human rights documents since 1966 in the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. Just to review where that came from, we studied at the beginning of the course the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that led, almost 20 years later, to two conventions that specified those aspirational human rights into two separate areas. One was civil and political rights, and the other was economic, social, and cultural rights. And then, just to remind you, it takes another more than a decade to create the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, which we have also studied. So when we think about women in politics or women's political participation, we need to keep in mind that women's low status and exclusion in society carries over into the political realm. And we have been exploring various dimensions of that throughout our course so far. On the other hand, political power is critical for gender equity, for creating a society in which women have equality and power and are considered full members of society. As with other areas that we've studied, having rights on paper doesn't automatically mean that those rights can be exercised. So some of what we're dealing with is the association of what's called the public sphere with men, and politics being considered part of the so-called public sphere, whereas women are associated with the private sphere, meaning specifically the home and associated activities. This has made it difficult sometimes for people to imagine women having a full role in the political realm. Let's distinguish between different aspects of what we're talking about. There is women's political participation, and then there's women in political leadership. Over the last century, women have slowly gained the right to vote, or the suffrage, in most countries in the world. What is sometimes called the first wave of feminism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries became very focused on this goal. In the US, women gained the vote in 1920. We were not the earliest group. Some countries have granted the women the right to vote very recently as since the 1980s. That includes countries like Iraq, Liechtenstein, South Africa, Hong Kong, and finally Saudi Arabia just in 2015. Keep in mind that the history of women gaining the right to vote has often been tied up with racial politics, and that was definitely the case here in the United States and in countries like South Africa, where white women had the right to vote way earlier, decades earlier, than women of color did. Women political leaders, especially in the top positions, have been increasing in number worldwide, but the numbers are still fairly small. In some countries, you find more women in lower level political leadership, such as at the uh, town or city level, county governments, state governments, and so on. But they're still the minority, and those lower level positions become feeders into higher level national leadership. Let's talk about voting just a little bit more. It should go without saying, but in democracies, voting is the most fundamental form of political participation. As I said, women's suffrage has been gained slowly. In the US, it was gained in 1920 after 72 years of activism. But Native American women only got the right to vote in 1924. In South Africa, white women could vote starting in the 1930s. Indian and so-called colored women, which in South African nomenclature means biracial or mixed race people, in 1984, and then finally black women in 1994 after the end of apartheid and the new constitution that was written in South Africa. Oh, I have a mistake here. Saudi Arabia women did get the right to vote not too long ago. What are women like as voters? Well, this is a matter of a lot of recent research. We now have something in the United States called the gender gap, and it's found in some other countries as well. In the US and Western democracies, there's some evidence that as women gain more rights and gender roles become less rigid, women move from voting toward the conservative side to voting more on the liberal side. The problem is the research on this is pretty recent and we don't really know how consistently this plays out. So we'll have to wait and see what this really means over the future. In 2016, in the United States presidential election, the majority of white women voted for Donald Trump, who is widely seen as being certainly not liberal and actively against women's interests in many ways. However, Black and Latina women and men did not vote for Trump. They voted, on the whole, for Clinton. Of course, it's worth remembering that Clinton won the popular vote, even though Trump became president through the Electoral College. But those racial politics, those racial differences and class differences and so on, they complicate this question of whether there's something as simple as a gender gap in voting. Now, voting is no guarantee of political power. Women's suffrage is just a foundation. Equality of opportunity in politics is much more complex, and it is influenced by factors like whether male family members control or influence the vote of women members, whether there are literacy barriers. If women are not educated as well as men, then of course they may have less access to political information and so on. And then there are, of course, cultural barriers, the idea that women just have no role in politics. The pictures on this slide include a Saudi Arabian woman casting a vote for the first time in 2015. And then there's a picture of a women's rights conference without any women attending. That's kind of interesting in the same country. Now, Sean Megan Byrne, in the textbook Women Across Cultures, does write about women in politics. And as you can see from this graphic, there are multiple barriers to women getting involved in politics. Of course, these operate in different ways in different countries based on how gender and power dynamics are being played out. So it's important to delve into the studies of each country and the specific context in order to really understand this. But you can see there women's private sphere responsibilities, in other words, in the home, gender stereotypes and leader prototypes, occupational segregation that may keep women out of the sort of the pipeline toward politics, sexism in political organizations themselves, and then there can be barriers in electoral systems that make it difficult for women to vote. Now, for example, in the US, connecting the United States to this graphic, there's some recent research that implicit bias, in other words, biases that people are not aware that they have, but that nevertheless influence their thinking, can also influence political decisions. And some people have suggested that this was an important factor in the loss of Hillary Clinton, in addition to her, some opposition to her views and her political stances, that there was also just implicit bias against her as a woman. Here's a recent example of male politics in the United States. This was the so-called Freedom Caucus, which is a segment of the U.S. Congress that has specific, very conservative views, holding discussions about health care policy. And there were no women involved in these discussions in 2017. So, women's representation in parliaments, congresses, and cabinets, they're all important. They have symbolic importance because they represent equality, but they also have practical importance because the kind of legislation and social policy that addresses so-called women's concerns, issues like peace, children, social justice, violence against women, reproductive rights, and health care, may get more attention when there are more women in the room making those decisions. Of course, when there are no women in the room, we know that women's concerns do not get taken into account. So it can be very important. Studies by the United Nations estimate that you need at least 30% women in order to reach what's called critical political mass, or the idea of critical mass, in order for women to really have a significant influence on the kind of policies that a political body creates. The U.S. is currently at about 20%. Our state legislatures are at about under 25%. And so we're still well under the 30% critical mass. Now, around the world, here are some examples of current women heads of state or heads of government in countries all over the world. I have a couple of examples from Africa, from Liberia and Mauritius, some examples from Asia, Nepal, South Africa, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and a couple of examples from Europe, and there are others. This just gives you an example of the diversity of women who have gained that status at the top of their political leadership, which is an encouraging sign. So Byrne again summarizes some of the conditions that can lead to more women being in political leadership. One starts with political literacy. That means that there has to be education and information, and people have to understand it. Electoral systems that have been put in place in many countries in the world that for example, create quotas or temporary quotas that say, a certain percentage of the parliament has to be women, or a certain percentage of the candidates have to be women. We need changes in gender ideology. The belief systems that say women don't belong in politics has to change. And then finally, she says the feminist funding and mentoring of women candidates is an important step. An example of that here in our country is an organization called Emily's List, and it's an organization that raises money for women candidates and mentors them to run for office. And the name Emily is an acronym for Early Money is Like Yeast. In other words, if you have money early in the process in US politics, that helps you get more money to go forward, which is essential, unfortunately, in the US system. Now, while having women represented in politics is so important, we have to keep in mind that we can't be essentialist about gender in politics. As my old professor, Sylvia Walby, said years ago, women can be the bearers of patriarchy. And this is United Kingdom Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who in the 1980s instituted many policies that were considered anti-woman and certainly not supporting women's inclusion or supporting policies that benefited women. She was an extremely conservative leader, similar to our Ronald Reagan here in the United States. And, she was really saw herself as an exception, and really acting like an honorary man rather than providing a vehicle or a means for women to gain more political power. So I want to come back to this, to end this, the concept of critical mass. And that is that in order for any group that has been excluded to gain representation and leadership and equality, you have to have more than one person or just a few people, a handful of people, because when there's just one or just a few, those people become tokens and they don't really have the power to implement a different kind of approach. So many women in politics can make a difference. So I encourage you to watch for movements and candidates and maybe prepare to run for office yourself. Here's an example of someone doing that right now. Samina Mustafa talking to a constituent at because she's starting her own campaign to run for Congress here in Evanston in 2017. These are just some of the sources that I got information from on specific slides, so that if you need to look for something, you can track them down. Thank you.